Let's begin our discussion of skeletal muscles. This first video we're going to introduce ways we name muscles and how to go about learning skeletal muscles. When it comes to learning a skeletal muscle, knowing how and why they named the muscle is really half the battle. If you know why a muscle was named what it was, that typically will help you either identify that muscle or know the action of that muscle. The action of a muscle is the function of that muscle. That is usually moving a bone or moving skin or acting at a joint. So this first table here are all the different methods that we are using to name muscles. The first method is the direction or orientation of the muscle. There's three words we often use to describe the direction in which the muscle is running. Rectus means parallel to the midline. It could be the midline of the body, it could be the midline of maybe a leg, or we even use that when we learn muscles that move an eyeball, in that it might run parallel to the midline of the eyeball. An example given here is the Rectus Abdominus. So two parts to that muscle name. The first part refers to the fact that it runs parallel to your midline, and then abdominis tells you exactly where you would want to look to find this muscle. You look for it in the abdomen. And when we get to a picture, you'll see that this muscle runs parallel to your midline. It's divided into sections by these little tendons, and we often refer to it as our six-pack. Transverse means the muscle runs perpendicular to the midline. There's another one of these, or there's an example of this in your abdomen as well. The transversus abdominis runs perpendicular to the midline. And then if the muscle runs on an angle, we can use the word oblique. There's external and internal obliques that run on opposite angles in your abdomen. This next section talks about different words we use to describe the size differences between a couple muscles. So if we've got similar muscles that do similar things in a similar location, and one's larger than the other one, we might use maximus and minimus. We might use major and minor. We might use magnus, all to describe size differences. For instance, in your gluteal region, there's a large muscle called the gluteus maximus. There's a smaller one called the gluteus minimus. There's even one in between these called the gluteus medius. Maybe you might have two muscles that do the same thing, and one of them's longer than the other one. We use longus and brevis. Brevis means short. We have some adductors in our thigh. They adduct your femur, so they move your femur towards the midline of the body. There's actually three of them. There's an adductor longus, there's an adductor brevis, so one's longer, one's shorter, and there's an adductor magnus, that's the largest one. So these are all names based on size. Latissimus means wide, vastus means huge, all based on size of the muscle. Shapes. Some muscles have distinct shapes, so we use the word that describes the shape to name it. Deltoid is triangular. The trapezius muscle in your upper back and neck is trapezoid shaped. We've got some muscles that have kind of a sawtoothed or serrated look, so we use the word serratus. There are some rhomboids in your back, which are diamond shaped. When we get to facial expression, we have some circular muscles. One encircles your eyes. It's called the orbicularis oculi. There's also one that surrounds and encircles your mouth. It's called the orbicularis oris. So these are all based on shapes. We also have action terms. So these terms are used to describe the specific action the muscle might do. So for example, we've got muscles in our forearm that flex your wrist. So we call them flexor carpi muscles. One of them runs along your radius, so we call it the flexor carpi radialis. There's another one that runs along your ulna, so we call it the flexor carpi ulnaris. If you've got flexors of the wrist, you have extensors of the wrist, extensor carpi ulnaris, and we have a radialis. If the muscle abducts, we might use that in the name, abductor pollicis longus. Pollicis refers to your thumb. This muscle abducts your thumb. So you can look through the rest of these on your own, but these are all based on specific actions the muscle might do. Finally, we've got number of origins. We'll be talking more about these in a moment when we talk about what an origin is. Location, temporalis is found near your temporal bone. Frontalis is found on top of your frontal bone. So those are based on location. Finally, we have what's called the origin and insertion. These are the sites where the muscle attaches. And again, we'll look at this one when we get into the neck, but there's a muscle that originates at your sternum and clavicle, sternocleidomastoid, and it inserts, it attaches to your mastoid process. So it's known as the sternocleidomastoid. So if you get to a muscle and you don't know why it was named, look up the meaning of the names used in the muscle. Next thing I want to do is talk about some terminology. You're going to hear me say origin and insertion a number of times. You're going to hear me say synergist versus antagonist. So you should be familiar with what these words mean. A muscle typically has two ends. One of the ends of the muscle usually does not move, whereas the other end of the muscle is the moving end. The non-moving attachment site of a muscle is called the origin. The moving attachment site is known as the insertion. So let's look at a couple examples. In your brachium, which is your upper arm, you have a muscle called the biceps brachii muscle. You've probably heard of it. This muscle has two origins, hence the name bicep. So it has two attachments at this end. One of them is just above the glenoid cavity, right there. The other one is on that coracoid process. Those two attachment sites are the origins, so that's the non-moving end. Your bicep does not move your scapula. The two tendons off those two origins, will then combine to form what we call the belly of the muscle, which is where most of the thick muscle fibers are located. Then at the other end, the tendon that attaches to the moving end is known as the insertion. And we've already learned that insertion. The insertion of the biceps brachii muscle is the radial tuberosity, that little rough surface on the radius. So this is the moving end. So when this muscle contracts, it moves your radius towards in essence, the origins, and that then will tell you the action. The biceps brachii muscle flexes at the elbow joint. Posterior to the humerus, there's a triceps brachii muscle. Triceps referring to the fact that it has three origins. You really can only see two of them here, but there's a third origin as well. So it doesn't move those sites, it moves at the insertion. The insertion is at the olecranon of your ulna. And then when this muscle contracts and pulls on that olecranon, it extends your elbow. So that brings us to the next set of terms, synergist and antagonist. When you have more than one muscle doing the same action, They are synergistic. Usually one of them provides the most of the force. We call the muscle that provides most of the force the prime mover. So for example, elbow flexion is done using your biceps brachii muscle. There's another muscle called the brachialis. This drawing doesn't show it, but it's deep or underneath the bicep. The brachialis also flexes the elbow, so it is synergistic to the biceps brachii. They do the same thing. They work together to provide a strong elbow flexion. Although, if you compare the force, your biceps is stronger, and therefore it is known as the prime mover of elbow flexion. Similar situation occurs with your elbow extensors. Your triceps is the prime mover of elbow extension. There's another one not shown on this drawing. It's a small muscle down here called the Antagonist. It is a synergistic muscle. It also helps to extend the elbow. So that hopefully introduces you to prime mover and synergist. Next one is antagonist. When your elbow is flexing, your prime mover is your biceps brachii, your brachialis is synergistic, your triceps brachii is antagonistic. It does the opposite of your biceps. And typically when you are moving a joint, one muscle group is working or causing that action, and the antagonistic muscle has to relax. So if you just practice flexing and extending your elbow, you can feel that when you flex, your bicep contracts and your tricep relaxes. When you extend, your triceps contracts and your bicep relaxes. So your biceps brachii and your triceps brachii are known as antagonistic muscles. They do opposite actions. Okay, next video we're going to begin. We're going to begin by learning muscles of facial expression, and then we will continue down our list of muscles, learning the muscle name and why it might have been called that, then talking about the action of the muscle and being able to identify that muscle.